I was halfway through organizing my garage on a freezing Saturday morning in Boulder, Colorado, when Patricia Whitmore knocked on my door with the kind of force that suggested she meant business. It was January 2026, and the temperature had been hovering around 15 degrees for the past week, with forecasts predicting a major blizzard moving in from the Rockies within the next 48 hours. I had just finished restocking my winter emergency kit, something I did religiously every year before the worst of the season hit. "Mr. Montgomery." Patricia's voice cut through the cold air like a knife when I opened the door. She stood there in her pristine white puffer coat, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the wind, clutching her ever-present HOA clipboard. "I need to speak with you immediately about a violation." I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped aside slightly, not quite inviting her in but acknowledging her presence. "Morning, Patricia. What violation would that be?" Her eyes narrowed as she consulted her clipboard. "Multiple neighbors have reported that you have excessive storage in your garage that violates Section 12.4 of our community guidelines. Additionally, there are concerns about potential hazardous materials." I felt my jaw tighten. Hazardous materials. "Patricia, I have winter emergency supplies. We live in Colorado. There's a major storm coming. The HOA board has determined that your storage practices pose a potential risk to the community. I need to inspect your garage immediately, and depending on what I find, we may need to confiscate certain items until we can properly assess their compliance with community standards." This was typical Patricia. She had been the president of the Meadowbrook Heights HOA for 3 years, and in that time, she had transformed what used to be a reasonable homeowners association into something resembling an authoritarian regime. She had fined elderly Mrs. Chen for having the wrong shade of white on her mailbox. She had threatened to put a lien on the Morrison family's house because their teenage son's basketball hoop was 2 inches over the height limit. And now she was coming after my emergency preparedness supplies. "Patricia, I'm not letting you confiscate my emergency supplies. That's ridiculous and potentially dangerous with the weather we have coming." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Mr. Montgomery, I don't think you understand. This isn't a request. According to Section 23.7 of the HOA Covenant, the board has the right to enter and inspect any property that poses a potential hazard to the community. If you refuse to cooperate, we can pursue legal action and fine you up to $500 per day of non-compliance." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. What Patricia did not know, what apparently none of the HOA board members bothered to research, was that I was Isaac Montgomery, the lead disaster preparedness instructor for Boulder County's Emergency Management Division. For the past 8 years, I had been training first responders, community volunteers, and yes, even some HOA disaster response teams throughout the region on how to prepare for and respond to emergencies. The irony of the situation was almost funny. Almost. "Fine," I said, stepping back and gesturing toward my garage. "Come take a look, but I'm documenting this entire interaction." I pulled out my phone and started recording. Patricia's expression soured, but she marched past me toward the garage. I had spent the morning organizing everything meticulously. On the left side, I had 5-gallon water containers, properly sealed and dated. I rotated these every 6 months, which was standard practice. Next to those were clearly labeled bins containing non-perishable food supplies, enough for 2 weeks, as recommended by FEMA. I had medical supplies in a clearly marked first aid kit, including prescription medications in their original containers. On the right side were tools, A backup generator with properly stored fuel in approved containers, battery-powered radios, flashlights, blankets, and cold weather gear. Everything was organized, labeled, and stored according to the exact standards I taught in my professional training courses. Patricia walked through my garage like a general inspecting troops, her lips pursed in disapproval. She pointed at the generator. "This is a fire hazard." It's a Honda EU 2200i, one of the safest generators on the market, and the fuel is stored in approved containers that meet all local and federal regulations. I responded calmly. She moved to the water containers. "These are taking up excessive space." "Those are 5-gallon water containers. FEMA recommends 1 gallon per person per day for at least 3 days. I have enough for 2 weeks because, as you may have noticed, we live in an area prone to severe winter storms that can knock out power and water for extended periods." Patricia ignored me and continued her inspection. She stopped at my medical supplies. "These medications could be dangerous." "They are my prescription medications, clearly labeled with my name and current prescription information. Keeping emergency medications on hand is standard disaster preparedness protocol." She scribbled notes on her clipboard furiously. "The board will need to review all of this. In the meantime, I'm issuing a formal notice that you have 72 hours to remove these items or face daily fines." I felt anger rising in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "Patricia, there's a blizzard coming in less than 48 hours. The National Weather Service is predicting up to 3 feet of snow with sustained winds of 40 miles per hour and gusts up to 60. This is exactly the kind of situation these supplies are meant for." "That's not my concern," she said, finishing her notes. "My concern is maintaining community standards and safety. You'll receive formal notice by email within the hour." She turned on her heel and walked back toward the street, her boots clicking against my driveway. I stood there in the cold, watching her get into her pristine white SUV and drive away. My hands were shaking, partly from the cold and partly from frustration. I went back inside and immediately called my colleague, Dave Richardson, who worked in the county's legal division. "Dave, I need some advice on HOA law," I said when he picked up. "Isaac, what's going on?" I explained the situation, including Patricia's threat to confiscate my emergency supplies and fine me. Dave listened quietly and I could hear him typing. "Okay, first of all, they can't just confiscate your property without due process," he said. "Second, emergency preparedness supplies are specifically protected under Colorado Statute 38-33.3-206.5. HOAs cannot prohibit reasonable emergency preparedness measures. And third, you're Isaac Montgomery. Doesn't your agency train disaster response teams?" "We do. In fact, I'm pretty sure we trained some volunteer groups from this area last year. Let me check my records." I pulled up my work laptop and scrolled through the training logs. Sure enough, in March of 2025, my team had conducted a 2-day disaster preparedness certification course for community volunteers in Boulder County. I scanned the participant list and felt a grim satisfaction when I saw several familiar names: Jennifer Schaefer, Marcus Delaney, and Robert Chen, all residents of Meadowbrook Heights. All volunteers who had signed up to be part of the community disaster response team. And according to my notes, the HOA had actually sponsored their participation in the training. "Dave, this just got interesting. The HOA paid to send community members to my disaster preparedness training last year." Dave laughed on the other end. "Oh, this is rich. So they paid you to train their people on the exact thing they're now trying to fine you for." "Apparently so." "Look, can you send me a summary of that statute you mentioned? I want to have it ready when they send me their formal notice. Already emailing it to you. And Isaac, document everything. Every interaction, every email, every threat. If this escalates, you're going to want a paper trail. We hung up, and I spent the next hour documenting the morning's events in detail, including time-stamped photos of my organized garage and all of my supplies. True to her word, Patricia sent an email at exactly 11:15 that morning. The subject line read, "Formal notice of violation and required remediation." The email was 3 pages long, full of cited HOA bylaws and covenant sections, most of which had been creatively interpreted to support Patricia's position. The core demand was simple: remove all emergency supplies from my garage within 72 hours or face fines of $500 per day, plus potential legal action to place a lien on my property. I forwarded the email to Dave, then sat down to compose my response. I kept it professional but firm, citing the Colorado statute that protected emergency preparedness measures, and pointing out that all of my supplies met or exceeded federal and state safety standards. I also mentioned, in passing, that I found it interesting the HOA was taking this position given that they had sponsored community members to attend disaster preparedness training that I had personally conducted. I sent the email and waited. The response came within 30 minutes, but this time it was not from Patricia. It was from Richard Helmsley, the HOA's attorney. Mr. Helmsley's email was even more aggressive than Patricia's. He claimed that the Colorado statute I had cited did not apply to HOA covenant restrictions, and that my refusal to comply would result in immediate legal action. He also suggested that my mention of having trained community members could be construed as a conflict of interest and an attempt to leverage my professional position for personal gain. I read the email twice, feeling my blood pressure rise. This was getting ridiculous. I called Dave again. "They lawyered up already," Dave said when I explained. "That was fast. Okay, here's what I think. They're overreaching, but fighting this through legal channels is going to take time and money. Do you have anyone on that disaster response team you trained who might be willing to speak up?" I thought about it. Jennifer Schaefer had been particularly engaged during the training, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. She had mentioned during one of the breaks that she had gotten involved in emergency preparedness after her parents had been stranded during a bad storm in Minnesota years ago. I looked up the community directory and found her number. "Jennifer, this is Isaac Montgomery. I was your instructor for the disaster preparedness certification last March." "Oh, Mr. Montgomery. Yes, I remember. How can I help you?" I explained the situation, trying to keep my tone neutral and factual. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Wait, Patricia is trying to make you remove your emergency supplies. The same supplies you taught us we should all have." "That's correct. She seems to think they violate HOA standards." Jennifer made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "This is insane. We literally have the same setup you're describing, because that's what you taught us to do. Half the disaster response team has their garages organized exactly like you showed us. Would you be willing to come to the next HOA board meeting and speak about the importance of emergency preparedness?" "Absolutely. And I'll bring the others too. This is ridiculous." We agreed to meet up the following day to coordinate. I spent the rest of Saturday monitoring the weather forecasts and preparing for the incoming storm. By evening, the predictions had intensified. The National Weather Service had upgraded the winter storm watch to a warning, predicting up to 3 feet of snow starting Sunday night and continuing through Tuesday. They were recommending that people stock up on supplies and prepare to stay home for several days. Sunday morning brought more emails from the HOA. Patricia had apparently rallied the board, and I received individual messages from 3 other board members supporting her position and emphasizing the severity of the fines I would face if I did not comply. What none of them seemed to realize was that they were creating a detailed electronic record of harassment that would be very useful if this ended up in court. I met Jennifer at a coffee shop in downtown Boulder that afternoon. She brought Marcus Delaney and Robert Chen with her, both of whom I recognized from the training. Robert was actually Mrs. Chen's grandson, which added another layer of irony to the situation given Patricia's previous harassment of his grandmother. "This is personal for me," Robert said as we sat down with our coffees. "Patricia has been making my grandmother's life miserable for the past 2 years. The mailbox thing was just the latest. She tried to fine her for having decorative rocks that were supposedly the wrong color. She complained about her garden being too visible from the street. It's been non-stop harassment." Marcus nodded. "She's been after my family too. We have a wheelchair ramp for my dad, and she tried to say it was not aesthetically pleasing and needed to be removed. We had to get a lawyer involved to cite disability accommodation laws." Jennifer looked at me seriously. "Isaac, what Patricia is doing to you is part of a larger pattern. She's been using the HOA as her personal fiefdom, and she targets anyone she perceives as a threat or who does not fall in line with her vision for the community. The problem is that most people can't afford to fight back legally, so they either comply or move." "How did she even become HOA president?" I asked. "Low voter turnout," Marcus said. "Most people don't pay attention to HOA elections." Patricia got herself and 3 of her friends elected to the 5-person board because they were the only ones who showed up to vote aside from maybe 20 other homeowners out of 200 properties. Robert leaned forward. "But here's the thing. There's an annual meeting coming up in 2 weeks. That's when the full community can vote on major issues and board positions. If we can get enough people to show up, we can potentially remove her." "That's longer than the 72-hour deadline she gave me," I pointed out. "Then we need to take a 2-pronged approach," Jennifer said. "First, we show up at the emergency board meeting she'll have to call if you don't comply. We bring evidence that what you're doing is not only legal but recommended. Second, we start organizing for the annual meeting to address the broader issues." It was a solid plan. We spent the next hour strategizing and dividing up responsibilities. Jennifer would reach out to other community members who had been affected by Patricia's overreach. Marcus would gather documentation about disability law violations. Robert would contact a local news reporter he knew who had done stories about HOA abuses in other communities. And I would prepare a presentation on disaster preparedness and the legal protections for emergency supplies. By the time we left the coffee shop, the snow had started. It was just light flurries, but the temperature was dropping fast. I drove home carefully, my mind racing with everything we had discussed. When I got back to my house, there was a notice taped to my front door. Patricia was not wasting any time. The notice declared that an emergency board meeting would be held Monday evening at 7 p.m. to address my violation and determine appropriate penalties. Monday morning brought the full force of the storm. I woke up to nearly a foot of snow already on the ground, with heavy flakes continuing to fall. The wind was howling, creating drifts that were already 3 feet high in some places. My phone was buzzing with alerts from the county emergency management system. We had activated Level 2 protocols, which meant non-essential personnel should stay home, and essential personnel should prepare for possible extended shifts. I was considered essential personnel, but the protocol was to work remotely unless called in for active emergency response. I spent the morning on conference calls with other county emergency managers, coordinating shelter openings and checking in with vulnerable populations. By noon, we had reports of power outages affecting several thousand homes in the county. By 3 p.m., that number had tripled. The irony was not lost on me that while I was helping coordinate emergency response for the entire county, my own HOA was threatening to fine me for being prepared for exactly this kind of situation. At 5 p.m., I received a call from my supervisor, Michelle Torres. "Isaac, we've got a situation developing in the Meadowbrook Heights area. Power is out and several residents are calling in concerned about elderly neighbors. Can you head over there and do a wellness check? I know that's your neighborhood." "On it," I said, already pulling on my winter gear. I loaded my truck with extra supplies, blankets, flashlights, and some of the emergency food from my supposedly problematic stash. The roads were barely passable, but my truck had 4-wheel drive, and I had snow chains in the back if needed. Meadowbrook Heights looked like a snow globe. The streets were buried and most houses were dark. I started with Mrs. Chen's house, knowing she lived alone. I had to wade through knee-deep snow to reach her door. She answered after the third knock, bundled in multiple layers of clothing. "Mr. Montgomery." "Oh, thank goodness. My power went out hours ago and it's getting cold inside. Do you have anywhere you can go? Family or friends with power?" "My grandson Robert, but I can't drive in this and I don't want to bother him." "Mrs. Chen, he's your grandson. It's not a bother. Let me call him." Robert answered immediately and said he would come get her as soon as he could get his car out. In the meantime, I gave Mrs. Chen some extra blankets and a battery-powered heater from my truck, along with some flashlights and non-perishable food. I showed her how to use everything safely and made sure she understood not to use any open flames for heat. I spent the next 2 hours going door to door, checking on elderly residents and families with young children. I distributed supplies, made sure people knew where the emergency shelters were, and helped a few people get to relatives' houses. By the time I made it back to my own house, it was 6:30, and I was exhausted, cold, and covered in snow. I had 30 minutes before the HOA emergency board meeting. Patricia had sent out an email that afternoon specifying that the meeting would be held via video conference due to the weather. I showered quickly, changed into clean clothes, and logged into the video call at exactly 7 p.m. Patricia's face appeared on screen, her expression stern. The 4 other board members were in their own little video boxes. I recognized 2 of them as Barbara Sutton and Donald Green. The other 2 I had seen around but did not know well. "Mr. Montgomery," Patricia began without preamble, "thank you for joining us. This emergency meeting has been called to address your continued violation of HOA covenants and your refusal to comply with the board's directive to remove hazardous materials from your property." Before I could respond, another video box popped up. It was Jennifer. "Excuse me, Patricia, but HOA bylaws state that homeowners have the right to bring witnesses or advocates to board meetings. I'm here representing a group of concerned community members." Patricia's jaw tightened. "This is an emergency meeting, Jennifer." Normal procedures still apply," Jennifer interrupted. "And I have the bylaws right here if you'd like me to cite them." 2 more video boxes appeared, Marcus and Robert. "We're also here as concerned community members," Marcus said. Patricia looked like she wanted to reach through the screen and strangle someone, but she composed herself. "Fine. Let's proceed. Mr. Montgomery, you were given 72 hours to remove items from your garage that the board has deemed a violation of community standards. That deadline expires in approximately 24 hours. What is your response? I unmuted myself and looked directly at the camera. Patricia, board members, my response is that I will not be removing my emergency preparedness supplies because they are protected under Colorado Statute 38-33-3-206.5, which specifically states that homeowners associations cannot prohibit reasonable emergency preparedness measures. Everything in my garage is reasonable, legal, and properly stored according to federal and state safety standards. That statute does not override HOA covenant restrictions, Patricia shot back. Actually, it does, Jennifer chimed in. And beyond the legal issues, what you're asking Isaac to do is dangerous and irresponsible. Isaac is not just a homeowner. He's the lead disaster preparedness instructor for Boulder County. He's the person who trained our community disaster response team last year. The same team that the HOA paid him to train. Barbara Sutton, one of the other board members, spoke up for the first time. Wait, what? Patricia, you didn't mention that Mr. Montgomery was a county emergency management instructor. That's not relevant to, Patricia started. It's extremely relevant, I interrupted. I've spent today doing wellness checks in this neighborhood because we have a major emergency in progress. I've been distributing supplies to elderly residents and families who need help. Supplies from the same emergency kit you're trying to make me remove. Robert unmuted himself. Patricia, Isaac just helped my grandmother. She was alone in a house with no power, and he brought her supplies and helped me coordinate getting her to safety. While you've been focused on harassing him about his garage, he's been actually helping this community survive a blizzard. Donald Green, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. Patricia, I think we need to take a step back here. If Mr. Montgomery is a professional in this field, and if his supplies meet legal standards, maybe we're approaching this wrong. Donald, we have multiple complaints from neighbors about, Patricia began. What neighbors? Marcus asked. I'd like to know who complained, because I've talked to at least 30 homeowners today, and not one of them has a problem with Isaac having emergency supplies. In fact, most of them wish they were as prepared as he is, especially right now. The meeting devolved into argument. Patricia tried to maintain control, but it was clear the other board members were having second thoughts. Barbara Sutton eventually proposed that they table the issue until they could get more information and legal clarification. Donald Green seconded the motion. Patricia tried to block it, but she was outvoted 3-2 as the meeting ended. Patricia's face was red with anger. This is not over, Mr. Montgomery, she said before disconnecting. I sat back in my chair, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Jennifer. That went better than I expected, she said, but Patricia is not going to let this go. I know, but at least we bought some time. More than that, did you see the chat during the meeting? At least 40 other homeowners were watching. People are talking. And Robert got in touch with that reporter. She wants to do a story. The next 2 days were a blur of emergency response work and media attention. The storm continued through Tuesday, ultimately dumping 34 inches of snow on Boulder County. Power outages affected over 15,000 homes, and my team coordinated shelter operations, wellness checks, and emergency services. I worked 18-hour shifts, barely sleeping. On Wednesday, as the storm finally began to clear, the local news ran a story titled HOA Threatens Disaster Response Expert Over Emergency Supplies During Blizzard. The reporter had done her homework. She interviewed me, Jennifer Robert, and several other Meadowbrook Heights residents. She also obtained copies of the emails Patricia had sent and the HOA's threat to fine me and place a lien on my property. The story went viral locally. By Thursday morning, it had been picked up by Denver news stations. By Friday, it was getting national attention on social media. The narrative was perfect for outrage. HOA president threatens emergency management professional for being too prepared during actual emergency. Patricia tried to do damage control, sending out a community-wide email claiming that the news story was misleading and that the HOA had only been concerned about proper safety standards. But the damage was done. Homeowners were angry, and not just about my situation. The news coverage had opened the floodgates, and other residents started coming forward with their own stories of Patricia's overreach. The HOA annual meeting was scheduled for Saturday, January 31st. In a typical year, maybe 30 people would show up. This year, over 160 homeowners packed into the Meadowbrook Heights Community Center, with another 40 joining virtually. The energy in the room was electric. Patricia tried to maintain order, but she had lost control of the narrative. Homeowner after homeowner stood up to share their experiences. Mrs. Chen talked about the constant harassment over minor aesthetic issues. Marcus's father, speaking from his wheelchair, described how the HOA had tried to make him remove his disability ramp. A young couple described being fined for having a small solar panel on their roof. An elderly veteran explained how Patricia had threatened him over displaying an American flag that was slightly larger than the HOA specifications allowed. Through it all, Patricia sat at the front table, her face growing redder and her knuckles whiter as she gripped her clipboard. When it was finally time for the vote on board positions, a slate of new candidates had emerged. Jennifer agreed to run for president. Marcus volunteered for vice president. 3 other level-headed homeowners stepped up for the remaining positions. The vote was not even close. Patricia and her allies were removed from the board by margins of over 70%, but the story did not end there. During the meeting, one homeowner brought up something that had been bothering him. He was an accountant and had requested to review the HOA's financial records, which bylaws stated should be available to any homeowner upon request. Patricia had repeatedly denied his requests, claiming she was too busy to compile the information. The new board made reviewing the finances their first priority. What they found was deeply troubling. Over the past 3 years, Patricia had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. She had charged expensive dinners to the HOA account, claiming they were board meetings, but many of them were at times when no meetings had been scheduled. She had hired her brother's landscaping company to maintain common areas at rates significantly above market value. Most damningly, she had been paying herself a salary of $5,000 per month as HOA administrator, a position that did not exist in the bylaws and had never been approved by the homeowners. In total, Patricia had misappropriated over $140,000 from HOA funds over 3 years. Jennifer, as the new board president, contacted the Boulder County District Attorney's office. They took the case seriously. Embezzlement of that amount was a Class 3 felony in Colorado. On February 15th, Patricia Whitmore was arrested at her home. Her attorney, Richard Helmsley, who had sent me those threatening emails, was also investigated for his role, though ultimately no charges were filed against him. The legal process took months. Patricia initially tried to claim the expenses were legitimate and that she had been authorized to pay herself. But the paper trail was clear, and multiple board members from her own slate testified that they had never approved the payments. In July, facing overwhelming evidence, Patricia accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony theft and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years if she made full restitution. The HOA recovered most of the stolen funds through a combination of liquidating Patricia's assets and insurance coverage. The new board used some of the recovered money to establish a proper emergency preparedness program for the community. They asked me to help design it, and I agreed. We set up emergency supply caches in the community center. We organized training sessions for residents on disaster preparedness. We established a formal community emergency response team, properly trained and equipped. We even got a grant from the county to install backup generators at the community center so it could serve as an emergency shelter during power outages. Mrs. Chen's mailbox stayed exactly the color it was, and no one said a word. Marcus's father's wheelchair ramp got a fresh coat of paint, funded by the HOA as an apology. The young couple expanded their solar panel array with the board's full support. As for me, I kept my emergency supplies exactly where they were in my garage. In fact, after the blizzard, several of my neighbors asked me to help them set up their own emergency kits. I ran weekend workshops in my driveway, showing people how to properly store water, organize supplies, and prepare for the unexpected. On a warm Saturday in August, Jennifer knocked on my door. This time, her knock was friendly rather than aggressive. "Isaac, got a minute?" "Sure, come on in." She held up a plaque. "The new HOA board wanted to give you this. It's a formal recognition for your service to the community during the January blizzard, and more importantly, an apology for how you were treated." The plaque was simple, but meaningful. It read, "Presented to Isaac Montgomery in recognition of extraordinary community service and dedication to emergency preparedness. Your actions during the January 2026 blizzard exemplify the best of what it means to be a neighbor. Thanks, Jennifer. This means a lot. You earned it. And not just during the storm. You stood up to a bully when a lot of people were too scared to. That made a difference." After she left, I hung the plaque in my garage, right next to my neatly organized emergency supplies. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded that sometimes standing your ground is about more than just principle. It's about protecting your ability to help others when they need it most. The winter of 2027 brought another major snowstorm to Boulder County. This time, Meadowbrook Heights was ready. The community emergency response team activated smoothly. The backup generators kept the community center warm and bright. And when I went door to door doing wellness checks, I found that most of my neighbors had their own emergency supplies now, stored safely in their garages, organized according to the guidelines I had taught them. Patricia Whitmore was still in prison, serving her sentence. Her house had been sold to pay restitution, and a nice young family with 2 kids had moved in. They planted a garden in the front yard, visible from the street, and no one complained. Sometimes I wonder if Patricia ever thought about the irony of the whole situation. She had tried to punish me for being prepared, but in doing so, she had exposed her own corruption and ultimately made the entire community safer and more prepared. Her attempt to seize my winter emergency kit had backfired in every possible way. The disaster response training I provided to community groups became more popular after the news coverage. Other HOAs reached out, wanting to learn how to balance reasonable community standards with emergency preparedness. I developed a specific curriculum for HOA boards, teaching them not just about disaster preparedness, but about the legal limits of their authority and the importance of serving their communities rather than controlling them. In the fall of 2027, I was invited to speak at a national conference on community resilience. I told the story of what had happened in Meadowbrook Heights, and it resonated with people across the country who had dealt with similar situations. The presentation got a standing ovation, and afterward, dozens of people came up to share their own HOA horror stories. But the most satisfying moment came on a crisp October evening when I was taking out my trash. My neighbor, a quiet man named Tom who had lived in the community for 20 years, stopped me. "Isaac, I just wanted to say thank you. I know everyone's probably told you this already, but what you did, standing up to Patricia, it changed things around here. For years, I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. Now it actually feels like a community again." That was what it was really about. Not the news coverage or the recognition, but the simple fact that people felt safe and comfortable in their own homes. They did not have to worry about arbitrary rules or vindictive enforcement. They could focus on being good neighbors instead of avoiding violations. As winter approached again in late 2027, I went through my annual ritual of checking and restocking my emergency supplies. My garage was still organized exactly the same way it had been when Patricia had first tried to make me remove everything. The water containers were fresh, the food supplies were rotated, the generator was serviced and ready, and the medical kit was fully stocked. The difference was that now, instead of looking at my supplies and seeing a potential source of conflict with the HOA, I saw them as a resource for the entire community. And I knew that if another emergency came, Meadowbrook Heights would be ready. One evening in December, I was sitting in my living room when my phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. It was a photo of her garage, neatly organized with emergency supplies almost identical to mine. The caption read, "Following the example of our resident expert, thanks for everything, Isaac." I smiled and sent back a thumbs up. Then I looked out my window at the quiet street, at the houses with their lights glowing warmly, at the neighborhood that had gone through so much turmoil and come out stronger on the other side. It had been almost 2 years since that cold January morning, when Patricia had knocked on my door with her clipboard and her threats. 2 years since she had tried to seize my winter emergency kit, and inadvertently set off a chain of events that would expose her corruption and transform an entire community. The journey had been stressful, frustrating, and at times infuriating. But looking back, I would not change how things had unfolded. Sometimes the universe has a way of correcting itself. Sometimes the bully gets what's coming to them. And sometimes, standing up for what's right leads to changes far beyond what you initially imagined. My emergency kit sat ready in the garage, a testament to preparation and resilience. Not just preparation for natural disasters, but resilience in the face of human-made obstacles. Patricia had tried to take away my ability to be prepared, to help my community, to do the job I had trained my entire career to do. She had failed spectacularly, and in her failure, she had inadvertently made Meadowbrook Heights one of the best prepared communities in Boulder County. The disaster response team we had built was now a model for other neighborhoods. The emergency protocols we had established were being copied across the region. The culture of preparedness I had tried to maintain in my own home had spread throughout the entire community. As I sat there in the warm comfort of my living room, I thought about all the people who had been helped by those emergency supplies Patricia had tried to confiscate. Mrs. Chen, warm and safe during the blizzard. The elderly veteran who had been able to heat his home when the power went out. The young family with a newborn who had food and clean water when they could not get to the store. Those supplies, that preparation, that knowledge, it had all made a real difference when it mattered most. And no HOA president with a clipboard and a power complex could take that away. The snow began to fall outside, gentle flakes drifting down in the glow of the streetlights. I checked my phone one more time and saw that the National Weather Service was predicting a mild winter storm, nothing like the monster blizzard from 2 years ago. But it did not matter whether the storm was mild or severe. We were ready. I was ready. My neighbors were ready. The community was ready. And that readiness, that culture of preparation and mutual support, that was Patricia Whitmore's real legacy. Not the corruption or the harassment or the petty tyranny, but the reaction she had provoked. She had tried to tear down and control, and instead she had inspired people to build up and support each other. I raised my coffee mug in a solitary toast to the falling snow, to the prepared community around me, to the supplies in my garage that had started it all. Patricia had tried to seize my winter emergency kit and had ended up facing federal charges. She had tried to fine me into submission and had lost everything. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my warm home, in a thriving community, doing the work I loved, surrounded by neighbors who understood the value of being prepared. The disaster response training program I ran had grown. The community partnerships had strengthened. And every winter, when the storms rolled in from the Rockies, I knew that Meadowbrook Heights would weather them together. That was how it should be. That was how it always should have been. And thanks to a HOA president who had overreached so badly that she had destroyed her own power base, that was how it would continue to be. I finished my coffee and headed upstairs to bed. Tomorrow, I had another training session to run, this time for a community group from Fort Collins. They had heard about what happened in Meadowbrook Heights and wanted to learn how to build the same kind of preparedness culture in their own neighborhood. The story of Patricia Whitmore trying to seize my emergency supplies and discovering too late that I trained disaster response teams had become something of a legend in Colorado emergency management circles. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked HOA power and a reminder that preparedness is not just about having supplies, but about having the community support to use them effectively. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because I had won a conflict or because someone had been punished, but because something good had come from something that had started so badly. A community had been transformed. People were safer. Neighbors looked out for each other. And my winter emergency kit, the catalyst for everything that had happened, sat ready in my garage, waiting for the next time it would be needed. Not as a violation of HOA rules, but as exactly what it was meant to be. A resource, a lifeline, a tangible expression of the commitment to be prepared, to be helpful, to be a good neighbor. Patricia Whitmore had tried to seize it and had seized instead her own downfall. That was justice. That was accountability. And that was the way it should be. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing Meadowbrook Heights in white. Inside, families were warm and safe, prepared for whatever winter might bring. And I slept soundly, knowing that I had done my job, stood my ground, and helped build something that would last long after the memory of Patricia's harassment had faded. That was the real story. Not the conflict, but the resolution. Not the problem, but the solution. Not the attempt to seize, but the community that stood together and said no. And in the end, that made all the difference.